Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this interesting episode with Rutendo, Benson, Matinyarare. The last one that we did it on the podcast channel, but we have decided to migrate everything to this platform. Welcome back, sir.
Yes, sir. How are you?
Better. You know, when we were just chatting and you said, my audience is not cultured in this type of conversations, something like that. I really felt that.
Yeah, no, what I said is that Urugupa chingwa chevana kumbwa. I am appreciated all over the world where I speak. Videos with 2 million views. We can't even do 3,000 views. What kind of people are those? My assumption is then they are not sophisticated enough for what we talk about.
Yeah.
But I give you the benefit of the doubt because Iwewe Wacho, you are sophisticated. So let's give them another chance.
Thank you. The Bible used to be true all the time. Gaguti, a prophet is without honor in his land. Pen with the Black Pen, SABC newsroom, your videos really do well. But when we try to put the conversation in the context of Zimbabwe, I don't know where the problem now comes.
The problem comes in the aspect that Zimbabweans tend to be emotional. I think that they lack sophistication, they lack intellect. Even though we are said to be the most educated Africans on the African continent, I think we're just lacking something in terms of thinking, reasoning, and removing our emotions. And Zimbabweans are lazy. The problem with me is I am not encouraging their laziness. I'm saying, hey, Zimbabwe's got opportunities. Take up the opportunities. Zimbabwe is only for those that are willing to work. It's not for those lazy guys who want jobs. It's for the guy that's willing to go and apply for a mining license, one who's going to apply for a farm. And if he doesn't get a farm, somebody who's going to rent land, somebody who's going to go to his village and start a business. I think I've shown you videos of, I've done videos of people who've got multi-million-dollar businesses, US dollars, in Zimbabwe from their villages, doing cows, doing chickens, doing goats, doing pigs. So Zimbabweans don't have an excuse. So when I speak, they don't like me because I speak to the individual. I make sure that the individual can't make an excuse. And it is those excuses that Zimbabweans want to make that I eliminate and make everybody look at themselves. And that pains a lot of Zimbabweans. That's why they don't like me.
Anyway, for a start, just tell me about your trip to Zimbabwe. Recently, I saw your videos at the airport, and a lot of people are on your back. Was that a paid trip?
Oh, no. I went to Zimbabwe because what is interesting is that I have just discovered the number of people we think are moneyed in Zimbabwe are way much more than the people that are moneyed. So I went to try and get access to one of the billionaires of our country, not those that are known, but an unknown billionaire that's got 15 large-scale mines in Zimbabwe. And I was blown away. And I went to say, I want to meet this guy. I want to get his story. But I understand that he doesn't speak to the media. He's a very secretive person. He's very private. So I tried, my brother. I went to his PA. I went to his offices. I went to his house. But I promise you, I'm going to eventually get that guy. And I'm going to tell his story because it's inspiring. So that's what I went for. So on my way back, this is when I realized, oh my God, the airport is looking absolutely amazing. And it just made me start to reflect because I'm one of those people that didn't support Emerson Mnangagwa. I didn't like him. I was a Mugabe supporter. I believed it was Mugabe's time to go. And there was no one better than Mnangagwa to come in, but I wasn't satisfied that he's the right person to take us forward. But he's proved me wrong. I don't agree with him compensating white farmers even till today. I do not agree with him removing indigenization, but I think he's come up with a new strategy of how to utilize the sanctions to indigenize Zimbabwe, to give Zimbabweans an opportunity, and the way that he opened up the mining industry to bring in small-scale miners and to legalize small-scale miners, to make them the biggest producers of gold in the country, was a very smart strategy that has made me reconsider my criticism of him removing indigenization, because indigenization is happening. And to some extent, it has actually been catalyzed by the opening up of the gold industry and bringing in the small scale miners. So I decided to say, you know what, let me do a balanced scorecard. Let me try and weigh my criticism of the president and then at the same time weigh what he's done. And the truth of the matter is that he's done more than the criticisms that I have for him, or let's call them his failures. And the criticism doesn't start here. The criticism started when I wrote an article where I wrote his successes and failures. And a lot of people in ZANU-PF were upset with me for giving him a 69% and criticizing him for some of the things that I'm not happy with. And then they were, even though I gave a good story of the things that he succeeded on, they had hoped that I would just simply eliminate the negatives and just give a good story. But that's not how things work. And so this time I was just making a video to say, okay, I criticized this man. I had my doubts about this man. I was not confident about this man. I thought he was going to sell out the country, and he's proved us wrong. He's proved me wrong. And I just thought I'll do a video just giving out my heart and saying that, you know what, let's give this guy another term. He deserves it. And I think he'll do a good job because he's built more infrastructure than what Robert Mugabe did in the past 22 years of sanctions. I understand the constraints. I understand that the current president is building on the foundation of the suffering that Robert Mugabe's regime, and which the president was part of, went through. But I actually think he's done a good job. And I think he'll do even a better job for us to get to the end of his second term. And I believe that Zimbabwe will be a better place by that time.
Well, listening to you now, I think you have done a good job clearing yourself that you are not a praise and worship singer.
I'm not a praise and worship singer. And part and parcel of why I remember somebody was saying that he was talking to one of the leaders in ZANU-PF, and he was saying, why don't you use this guy for communication? And then that person said, he's a suicide bomber.
You can't predict where he's going to go.
You can't predict where he's going to go because I shoot from the hip. And so when I support somebody, I support them wholeheartedly. When I give my compliments, I'm complimenting wholeheartedly. So I'm one of those persons that if I compliment you, you know I mean what I'm saying. I'm not saying it for any other reason. And that has become my brand, somebody who can just speak openly, who can speak frankly. And that is why I have the personality that I have. That's why I'm respected by other people outside Zimbabwe. So I can't damage that brand by trying to make people happy. I need to be the conscience of the nation wherever I can.
Yeah, it draws me back in time when Dr. Arikana Chiwombori became so popular over a Pan-Africanist sentiments. You know, everyone in the media wanted to talk to Dr. Arikana, and I saw that we were sort of having the same vision, having the same school of thought. But just one day, you went all arms out about the compensation of the whites, the 3.5 billion deal that the president signed, that he would compensate these white people. What is really your issue against that? A lot of people, they don't understand these things from a layman's point of view. What is really happening with that deal?
Look, Arikana is my mother, a very good mom. She is a great advisor. And I criticized her. I shouldn't have done it in public because, you know, as my mother, I should have had respect to talk to her on the side. But I couldn't contain my frustration then. And let me explain why I shouldn't have criticized her in public. Because as Pan-Africanists, we stand up in the eyes of the world. And when we criticize each other in public, we seem to be confirming their notion that Africans are always fighting each other. And then we reduce each other's images in public, which is not good. So that's another reason why you see that when I do criticize government, I will do it, but I've got boundaries. Because there are things that we should talk about inside the home, as we do with our fathers and our parents at home. We don't put our dirty laundry in the public. But anyway, my issue with the compensation of white farmers, which I can talk in public, because we have to fix the agenda of compensation of black people and reparations for black people if we're going to take Africa forward. One of the major reasons why Africa is stagnant is that we do not have capital to develop Africa. We don't have capital not because we never had capital, but it was stolen. It was stolen when our labor was stolen.
Yes.
When you look at Rhodesia was built, the moment the Rhodesians got here, the very first thing they did is they stole our cattle. And when I calculated the cost of the cattle that they stole and the compound value of that cattle, it's over $10 billion in today's terms. Because these guys stole up to 1 million cattle. And when you look at the compound interest they would have made over that period, you will realize that it was over $10 billion. But let me tell you what you're going to find interesting.
Yes.
When the European came here, they took our cattle. Then they began to hybridize our cattle and utilize European systems of farming. They got us to a point that when we get to 1960, Chad got independence. Chad then stopped using the French system of breeding their cattle, and they went back to the tradition. At the time that Chad got independence, their population was the same population, 5 million people, as Rhodesia. And they also had 2 million cattle, like Rhodesia. But today, Chad has got a herd of 30 million cattle in a population of 15 million people. They've been able to multiply
The number of cattle.
their herd by 15 times.
Yeah.
But Zimbabwe, which continued to follow the British system, we've only got 5 million cattle in the country today. Now tell me, why did Chad successfully breed its cattle 6 times more than Zimbabwe? It is because they stuck with the traditional methods. They did not hybridize. They did not put European breeds. They did not use vaccines. They did not utilize what the Westerners used, and they did not get restrictions on the number of cattle that black people could get. Because in Rhodesia, once you got more than 5 cattle or more than 10 cattle, they'll take some. So that is all value we lost. Do you know how much we lost in terms of those cattle if you compared with where Chad is today? $42 billion.
Yay.
$42 billion. So when we now look at this $42 billion that we lost, we look at the rentals of our land. When you take the value of our land and you understand that white people controlled through farming and through game parks and reserves and the cities that they built, they controlled 28 million square kilometers of land, 28 million square hectares. You then take those hectares and you look at the value of a hectare of land for rental in America. You'll find that they charge per acre. And according to them, an acre of land, you must pay $132 per acre of land a month. All right?
Yes.
And when you take that 132 per acre of land, it's the average in the whole of America. So there are higher prices than that. So let's go back to Zimbabwe. Let's then say, you know what, let's be conservative. I'm not going to give 132 per acre. And an acre is about 10 times smaller than a hectare.
Yes.
I'm now going to reduce it and say, let's call it $50.
The lowest.
From the time they took our land, from the time they started controlling 28 million hectares of the best land, the best game reserves, and so forth and so on, how much would we have made within that period in rentals had they been paying rentals? Would have made $1.5 trillion.
That's for the time that they used the land.
That's for the time that they used the land. I haven't even started looking at how much they were supposed to be paying the labor. Zimbabweans were said to have been paid 1/30th of what they were worth or what they should have been paid. 1/30th, my brother. So when you take 1/30th, our parents, the reason why you have got to look after your grandfather and your grandmother is they never had pensions. They never had salaries that were enough for them to save for their retirement. All that is money that went into the pockets of the Rhodesians. When you look at that value, and you look at the point that there was a time where Rhodesia had 600,000 workers, and you multiply that with 90 years, looking at the changes in that population, you realize that they robbed us of over $300 billion. Then you look at the gold they got out of the country, $80 billion of gold alone. We haven't even started looking at chrome, at coal, at steel, at iron, at lime. Do you understand where I'm going with this, man?
Actually, all these injustices, they deserve for a call of reparations.
Very good. So when my government forgets all that, and before I go, let me make a point that you will understand. Zisco Steel was the biggest steel smelter in Southern Hemisphere Go to Australia, there was nothing as big. South America, Brazil, there was nothing as big. Now remember, Brazil is a big country, but they didn't have a smelter as big as this.
Okay, when you're saying Southern Hemisphere, you're not talking about Southern Africa.
No, we're talking about the entire Southern Hemisphere under the equator.
The globe.
So we're the biggest under the equator. Even Australia didn't have. For us to pay for that Zisco steel, the plant, a majority of the payment was not made in cash, my brother. It was made in steel. So, for instance, Hitachi gave us some of the machinery and smelters that we're using there. And they made a deal with Risco at that time. It was called Risco. That we were going to pay 1 million tons of pig iron and steel for 60 years until we paid off the technology that they gave us. That's how Risco was built into the biggest steel plant. It was by us giving our iron. But where was the iron coming from? From our soil, from our workers. You understand what I'm saying? So that's how value was coming out of Rhodesia. And remember,
and do we still have the iron? Do we still have the iron?
We've got some of the biggest iron reserves in the world. Manise alone is said to have 50 billion tons of hematite.
Well, so and
that all these reserves of iron in Zimbabwe are owned by a company called BIMCO, and BIMCO is owned by Zisco Steel. So Zisco Steel is valuable just because of the resource they sit on in terms of limestone, chrome, and iron. Many people don't know that.
Yeah.
Right. So this is what the Rhodesians enriched themselves off. Even when they went under sanctions, my brother, the Americans made a law specifically for Rhodesia called the Bide Act to excuse the Americans from the sanctions of the UN so that they could continue to get chrome and continue to get nickel from Zimbabwe.
The Americans couldn't live without the Rhodesians at that time.
And at the time that we were under Rhodesia, and even all the way until 2000, we had 10 companies in Zimbabwe that owned 3 million hectares of land. One of them was called Wellabees. Wellabees owned 1 million hectares at some point, bigger than Belgium. They owned that in Zimbabwe, and they were mining cattle. That Wellabees was then taken over by Londro. So I'm just trying to let you know how much wealth these people were controlling.
I even heard that the Oppenheimers had also a lot of land in Zimbabwe.
Right now, the Oppenheimers have got 65 million hectares. I mean, 1,000 hectares.
What do they use it for?
Nothing. That's why they were mining. There were guys who wanted to mine there because apparently it's not a farm per se, even though they've got a ranch there. It is actually a repository of resources. And so there's a company that wanted those resources and wanted to explore and begin to do their explorations. And the Oppenheimers went to court saying that these guys had not done impact assessments or environmental impact assessment. Many people say they paid judges to make sure that the decision came in that way. But this is what we have. And here we've got a president who's saying no person must have more than 150 hectares, is that correct?
Yes,
but with 65,000, they're the biggest property owners in Zimbabwe.
And I even heard the president saying we are going to adopt a use it or lose it concept, that if you are not using the land, you should lose it.
If you are not using minerals, you should lose them as well, because precedence goes to those that are mining over the farmer. So now, back to the issue of compensation of white farmers. So in a country with so much injustice, in a country where the cheapest resources of the land were taken by colonizers who got it cheap, who used our slave labor and didn't pay rentals to us as Zimbabweans. And then they looted these resources. They used the railway lines that they created with the cattle they stole from our ancestors, the $42 billion worth of livestock that I said we lost. They used that money. They used our hard taxes. They used our slave labor to build a Rhodesia to extract the resources and to enrich themselves overseas. But they did not pay us the value that was due to us. They did these improvements they talk about were being made on stolen land. Even after independence, it was still stolen land because it had never been returned to its rightful owners. And the unjust enrichment that they got from this land was never returned to its rightful owners. Then we agree as a nation to then pay compensation to those farmers who were utilizing stolen land, to companies that signed BIPA agreements on stolen land. The BIPA agreements are null and void because the land was stolen and never returned to its owners. The Zimbabwe government at no point legitimately got the land that it was signing BIPA agreements on. It never at any point legitimately got the land that it was giving out to anyone.
It's like someone coming and stealing your car. Someone comes and steal your car, and then he customizes the car, put some mix, put some nice stuff on that car, and later you finally catch up with the guy and you take the car back, but you are told to pay for the improvements that that person put on your car.
It's even worse, where a person stole your car. After the person stole your car, they make a deal with our government. The government says, fine, you can go. We are going to adopt the car. They adopt the car, then they want to sell it to you, or they want you to pay for the mags. That is unacceptable.
So you mean it's us as the citizens who are paying the 3.5 billion, not just the government, per se?
100%. And the land never belonged to the government, like I'm saying. The land belonged to our chiefs and kings before we adopted the Eurocentric system. The Harare land belonged to Chief Mbari, right? And you can go all across the country. There are chiefs whose heads were taken to the United Kingdom. They were murdered. Their chiefs' heads were taken. Their land was taken. Their people were enslaved. Those are the rightful owners of that land, not some colonial creation called a government or a city council or a municipality. These are not African concepts. Those are Eurocentric concepts. Eurocentric concepts of colonialism and imperialism that appropriate public goods and put them into the hand of an institution that then goes and dishes out the very same land, the very same mineral rights to individuals who have got money. And we are saying that's an injustice. The African who lost the land should have been compensated. And today that compensation is still outstanding. How then do you take a dispossession of 130 years and correct it by first compensating the thief who took the land? That goes against the concept of restitution in Integram, which says, take that which was stolen, give it back to its owner, and then restore that owner into the position they would have been had they not been robbed. That means restore us of the trees that were taken away. Restore us of our labor and compensation of that labor. Restore us of the land that these people destroyed, the rivers that they silted, the poisons that they put in our soils. And if they cannot restore us, they must pay damages. Real damage.
But let me just think in these terms.
Before I go.
Yes.
So real damages, and then finally in the precept of restitution, you must return whatever wealth was created by the thief. Give it back. Otherwise, this person will be left with unjust enrichment that gives them an unfair advantage that they will then use to subjugate again he who they dispossessed and lost 130 years of wealth creation to.
What is the role of the South African government and the South African courts in this whole issue? Because I follow a YouTube channel in South Africa called SAI, and they talk more about white farmers, and they talk about court cases where even the president of South Africa is listed as a respondent in South Africa and South African courts on that issue. What is the role of the South African courts and the government?
The South African courts continue to be a bastion of colonialism and imperialism. And you will see that their judges, the jurisprudence or the law that they use, is a colonial law that was imposed on our people in the process of dispossession and the process of colonialism. In many ways, it's colonial law. And it's part and parcel of Roman Dutch law being utilized in a country where we don't have Romans and Dutch. So why are we using Roman Dutch law in a country and in a Zimbabwe and a continent where we don't have Romans and Dutch? It is because this is the law of subjugation. Why are we not using African law? Why are we using a law that determines, has a moratorium on when people can seek compensation in South Africa for land lost in colonialism? And you can only start seeking compensation for land that was lost after 1913, after the Land Appropriation Act. But why? What about the land that was lost since the Afrikaners began to come in what you call it, 1600
Yes.
or 1500? You see, a lot of people think that these Afrikaners only started coming in 1652. No, they were coming since the 1500s. They were coming as the VOC, right? And when they got here, Dutch East India Company, they began to appropriate land. They began to take land. But remember, in African culture, there was nothing like land ownership. Land was deemed to be something that belonged to the God who created the world. And we were only custodians who held the land in custody as communities that were led by kings and chiefs who didn't own the land. So by the mere fact of that certain people got compensation and then handed over land to whites, that was an illegality according to our own law and custom, because we did not sell land, because we never owned land. We were just custodians. A custodian can't give over title to something that they're only a keeper of. You see?
Yeah.
So the fact that the law that we use does not respect that, does not recognize those customs, does not give any life to those customs, makes it illegitimate law. The fact that it's by a majority of people who are more educated in the system and culture of Europe, and they do not get consent from their own individual or their own citizens to understand this new system that is contrary to African culture, means that it is illegitimate law. So that's what the South African courts stand for. They stand to continue to institute what is called the law of discovery, or the colonial law of the rule of the law of nations of 1453 that determined how to colonize the dark-skinned world. And that's why you see that when we had the land reform, they went to the SADC tribunal that was run by protocols written by South African jurisprudence and pushed by South African judges that made a decision that land reform must be reversed. But how can land reform be reversed when yet the decolonization agenda of 1960 said that natives must be given that which they lost during colonialism? It was then ratified again in another law that's called the Native Convention that seeks to restore what natives lost during a crime against humanity of colonialism.
So the land reform that happened in the early 2000s was just a sort of ratification of that law.
It not only ratification of that law, it was giving life to it. But why was it giving life to it in that way? Because the law had failed to deliver justice to the people. So when laws are created to stop chaos, laws are created to stop fighting and wars. But when your laws are unjust, when your laws are illegitimate, when your laws don't give people justice or the majority justice, eventually the majority will ignore the law, fight and overthrow, which is a revolution. And that is what so-called happened during the land reform program, is that the government took its time negotiating with the British, allowing South Africa to take its independence. But the people that they had no land, the people that were dispossessed were sick and tired. And eventually they rose up and began to occupy the land because it was theirs. And the legal system that they were being forced to use, a Roman Dutch law legal system, a Lancaster House Conference, a law that is illegitimate, that was created by a few men sitting in a little room being told by their former colonizers how to create rules, had now reached its course where people could no longer tolerate it. So people rose up. That rising up, and then that rising up being given life by a law that was created, the Land Appropriation Act 3, you see, meant that it was a legitimate process at the end of the day, because that's what the people wanted.
So why is it, I use my example as a young man, around 2000, 2001, 2002, I think I was grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, those years. Why is it I always see the land reform processes an injustice? And I always have a soft spot for the white people who lost their land. I feel pity for them, and I just think like, these ZANU-PF barbarics, they went and took the land, and now they are not using it for any benefit. Why do I think like that?
Number one, the MDC did a brilliant job of creating that narrative. The MDC created this narrative when the broad-based civil alliance was created by Brian Kagoro and other members. I think what is it called? Maduku was part and parcel of it. They were created and funded by the West to ensure that they can go out and tell people to vote no for the creation of a new constitution that would allow Zimbabwe to take land, and not only to take land, but to force the British to compensate their own children or the former settlers. Otherwise, the Zimbabwean government was not going to give compensation. So the ZANU-PF government was creating a constitutional amendment to create a new constitution to replace the old constitution, or the Lancaster House constitution. In that constitution, they wanted the compensation of farmers to be done by the British. The broad-based civil alliance then was sponsored by the West, by the British, I think Westminster Democracy Fund, the Americans, and their agenda was to, number one, ensure that Zimbabweans would vote no for a new referendum, for a new constitution. They would vote no on the pretext that they were told that the new constitution was about giving Robert Mugabe more powers. And it was about taking land from white farmers who we need in order to feed ourselves. So already a narrative was created that white people owned the land and it was theirs. And ZANU-PF wanted to take land that was not theirs from the white people that owned it. What they did not do in the broad-based civil alliance is to tell people the truth, that the land never belonged to the white people in the first place. It was black land, and the blacks never got compensated. They also did not tell people that the reason your Gogo, Kumusha, doesn't have anything, the reason there's so much poverty in the villages, is these white people never paid. Your grandfathers, your grandmothers, they used them as slaves, did not even give them pensions, did not give them salaries that they could sustain themselves. They could not even have enough to save because they were slaves. And therefore, that land needed to be returned to our grandfathers. They never told us that. They also told us that we can't grow food. Yet the liberation struggle was driven by peasants feeding the guerrillas. Nobody told them that. But I can't blame the broad-based civil alliance. I am blaming ZANU-PF for not having an informative campaign in which they were supposed to get buy-in from Zimbabweans to understand why we needed to change our constitution, why we needed to take back our land, why we needed to distribute that land, and the fact that we were not taking all the land. ZANU-PF had agreed to just take 8 million hectares.
Out of how many?
Out of 16 million arable, or the best land in the country.
And black
the
people
rest would be left to those 4,000 white farmers, while 9 million hectares would have been shared among 3 million indigenous people. Imagine that.
Yeah.
ZANU-PF failed to communicate that. So Vanamiti and people like Brian Kagoro, which I'm very surprised to hear Brian Kagoro now talking on Pan-African platforms, talking Pan-Africanism. They are now being paid by the West to become part and parcel of the Pan-African movement, when they are sellouts who created the MDC, and the sellouts who stopped the people from voting for a land reform and a change to the constitution. But anyway, that's another discussion.
Yes.
So they succeeded in making Zimbabweans vote no to a constitutional change. By doing that, they made sure that we could not change our constitution to enable us to take our land and to force the British to compensate their own children. So part and parcel of why you see today Emerson Mnangagwa saying we have to honor the constitution that we created in 2010 in 2013 to compensate white farmers, because that's what you Zimbabweans wanted. You refused a constitution that would have allowed us to get the British to compensate. You rejected that in 2000.
And in 10...
And so now I am left with no option but to do what you said in your 2013 constitution, which that we must compensate white farmers for developments on the land. Now, what Zimbabwe is doing is not new. Haiti compensated white farmers for losing their slaves in 1821. Henri Christophe was the president of Haiti, and Henri Christophe did not like the fact that from 1804, when Haiti got its independence, all the way until 1821, Haiti was struggling, being threatened by the Americans, being threatened by the Spanish, being threatened by the French, being threatened by the British, that they're going to come together, they're going to blockade Haiti so that it can't export its sugarcane. It can't export anything that is producing to the world so that it will starve. Then they were also threatening to invade Haiti because white farmers had lost wealth when their slaves were taken away from them. So Henri Christophe, who was the product of a white man and a black woman, then decided that he was now going to fix this issue and re-engage the French. So he re-engaged the French. The French said, okay, you must pay 21 billion gold francs for you losing our farmers, their slaves, and their wealth. Then that money will be given to compensate those slave owners. Remember, slavery was illegal, but people were going to be compensated for this illegality. Henri Christophe agreed.
The way I see it...
But let me tell you where it's interesting. The compensation of Haiti only ended in after the Second World War. Wow. So for close to 150 years, they were paying compensation.
More than a century.
For slavery, for an illegality.
And it seems like this is history repeating itself, because you see the main drive why the president wants Zimbabwe to pay that 3.5 billion is because it's presented as a prerequisite to re-engagement.
The problem is, when Haiti did this, they became the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. There was no re-engagement after they had paid this debt. In fact, they got invaded in 1915, where the Americans took all their gold, occupied their land, and they've been getting invaded by the Americans consistently ever since. The Americans, the Europeans, never re-engaged. They never did trade with Haiti. They never compensated Haiti. They never did anything to lift Haiti. That's why it's the poorest country in Europe, in the Western Hemisphere at the moment. Isusu in Zimbabwe, we did the same thing. When we got independence, we signed the Lancaster House Agreement and agreed to certain concessions with the intention of wanting to re-engage the West. First of all, the West was not automatically removing sanctions just because Rhodesia was defeated. No, they were willing to continue maintaining their sanctions on Zimbabwe. But they said, if you reconcile with the former whites, then we will then consider re-engaging with you. This included having what is called the ZimCode agreement and meetings, in which Zimbabwe now was talking to donors, asking for donors to give it money to rebuild, because it was a broke country when Rhodesia left it. It was broke, it was damaged by war, it was damaged by colonialism. So they had to get reconstruction and development loans to lift the country up. And then the West said, we will actually give you a grant. We can see that you will never build this country without a grant. And we're going to give you a grant of $4 billion. This grant will come in between 1980 and 1983. And it will help you to build what you need to build. It never came. After the Zimbabweans had signed the Lancaster House Agreement, which were the prerequisite that we will help you to build your country, give you grants if you sign it. They signed it. It never came.
And how true is the claims that are made by the ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula that the British, they were supposed to give Zimbabwe quite a number of pounds, but they didn't own up to it?
I love Fikile, but the number that he gives is not the correct number. He says 41 billion. It's not correct. There were a number of pledges that were made. The Americans made a pledge of $1 billion. This is land reform, separate from the Zim Code. Zim Code is one thing that was supposed to be used, a grant of $4 billion that was supposed to be used to rebuild the country, reconstruct the country, and to reindustrialize the country. Right? Then there was another one for compensation of white farmers for land that was going to be paid for 50-50 by the Zimbabwean government and the Americans. The Americans pledged $1 billion. The EU, or what was called the EEC, the European Community, they had pledged $750,000. And then the British had pledged £250,000. Million pounds. These are all millions, sorry. So 750 million by the Europeans, and then 250 million by the British. So all in all, it was about 2 billion that should have been used for land reform. Why? Because the Europeans wanted to take care of their children, not Zimbabwe. So they wanted to make sure that their children are paid in full, and they would be paid in foreign currency. So that if they want to relocate back to the UK, they go there without seeking welfare. They go there with enough money to go and stay there so that the British government does not have to pay social welfare for them.
Oh, I thought it was a love offering for us in Uzumba.
It was nothing to do with us. That's why when part and parcel of the agreement was in the beginning, while this money was being put together, the Zimbabwean government would pay compensation to white farmers for land that they didn't want in the willing buyer, willing seller. And the agreement was the Zimbabwean government must pay 50% of the money for the land in foreign currency up front. And then the British, the Americans would then bring their 50%. So imagine you are a country that has just come from colonialism where you are getting exploited. And I explained the level of exploitation. Then you have to start by compensating white farmers, but yet you are left with a debt by the Rhodesian government of $700 million. They leave you a debt of $700 million, which in today's money is 2.8 billion. And then on top of that loan that they already leaving you with, which was about buying weapons to fight your parents, to stop you from getting independence, you have to rebuild this country from the war. You have to rebuild this country from the sanctions of 13 years. Yeah. You have to rebuild this country from what colonialism didn't build. It didn't build schools for black people. It didn't build houses for black people. It kept them in villages, kept them in concentration camps called reserves. You have to build those things. But while you're doing that, buy land again in foreign currency. It was a way of making Zimbabwe broke.
But it is claimed that everything that we have was built by Ian Smith and SANU-PF. It built nothing. But you say they didn't build schools. How do you reconcile that?
This is why I love the discussion in numbers. When we get Rhodesia, only one out of every 600 students could make it over Form 2 to Form 3 and Form 4. 1 out of every 600 black children. Why? Because Zimbabwe, when it got independence, had only 5 high schools that could take black children, colored children, Chinese children, and Indian children to university, A-level. Only 5. 2 of them were dedicated to blacks.
Out of the 5. And the blacks were the majority.
And then the high schools were 60 high schools. Of those 60 high schools, 60% of them, not high schools, man, secondary schools were 260. Those 260 secondary schools, 60% of them were dedicated to whites. And then the remainder were for blacks. Now, secondary school is from Form 1 to Form 4. In a country with 7 million people.
Yeah.
So, and then they would go to a university, one university, that could only take 300 students per year.
University of Zimbabwe.
University of Zimbabwe. So already you're looking at infrastructure in this respect. 5 schools, Indians, coloreds, and blacks.
And some from Malawi and Zambia had to come also to use it.
And that's why, no. Most Zimbabweans actually went to university in Zambia because Zambia had more universities and more university spaces. So just that infrastructure, the education infrastructure, was nothing. When we got Zimbabwe, we had 1,860 schools in total, primary schools and secondary schools and high schools. Then Mugabe came in, or ZANU-PF comes in after independence, and in the first 20 years, they built 7,502 schools.
Why is it that it is not known?
Because ZANU-PF is not communicating its successes. In the same way, let me come from there. We never had a telephone exchange in Zimbabwe. The telephone exchange that Rhodesia used to use was a South African telephone exchange. But when Zimbabwe gets independence, the first thing they do is to build a telephone exchange, to digitalize telephone communications, and to build a satellite station in Mazoe. There never used to be a satellite station for satellite communication, right? Roads. When Ian Smith lives, he lives 9,830 kilometers of road. Right now, we've got 21,000 kilometers of tarred road. And then we've also got gravel roads that take our roads to 78,000 kilometers. Majority of those were done by ZANU-PF, and they had to build bridges. And they did it by a program that was called Food for Work. They would go in with DDF, they would say to the communities, come and work, and then you get a packet of mealie meal and a packet of usavi, you go home. That's how they built majority of the schools. That's how they built the roads. They used the community to build that infrastructure.
Well,
We never had communications infrastructure in the country. So I can go on. Wange Power Station was not built by Rhodesia. When Rhodesia left, it had 940 megawatts of electricity. Zimbabwe comes in. The Zimbabwean government immediately launches the Wange Power Station project. It was supposed to produce 1,300 kilowatts of electricity by the end. But by the time they finished up to Wange Power Station 1 up to 7, they had increased the electricity output from 940 megawatts to 1,560 megawatts. And that's what you're seeing. The project that's happening at Wange right now is a continuation of what was supposed to happen that stopped being funded by the World Bank. Hence, we had to stop at some particular point.
yeah, because I worked at Wange Power Station in 2014 as an apprentice, but I didn't know that it was built after independence. Because I never had, even at that power station, no one told us that this power station was built when it was just come and start working.
Why you sometimes hear me, my biggest critique of our government is that they don't communicate. And this is where people like you are supposed to be given your value. Where a government comes and says, right, we've got Zigo, he's a brilliant communicator. He's got videos that do 200,000 on Facebook. He's communicating and reaching more people than ZBC is able to reach of important influencers in the community. So we want a social media campaign where people like Zigo create content that we're going to use in mainstream media, but also use in social media to teach Zimbabweans how much work the government has done, where the government has taken the Zimbabwean people, and where it has put them. So for instance, like we're saying, when you say, okay, so what, this issue of school, so what? Let me tell you what, so what? When we got independence, we had 4,000 graduates in the country. Majority of those graduates were white. 3,000 of them were white. And less than 900 of them were black. When we get independence. Today, you've got more than 1.5 million graduates. That level of success of creating graduates and what we call Zimbabwe is renowned for its human capital. It's not a joke. Serious investment. That's why now you can have a Kudata Gure coming from nowhere to become a billionaire. Stride Masiwa coming from nowhere to become a billionaire, right? That's why you can have a person like, I'm going to leave certain names, but there are plenty billionaires. And they are created by this education investment that the government of Zimbabwe made. And many people don't realize the importance of investing in education before infrastructure. But when you come to South Africa and you see a country with great infrastructure, but does not have the investment in human capital, you begin to understand why it was important to start with the human capital, then go on to the infrastructure.
Yeah, I see. I think let us leave the conversation for now. We just want to round up with your recent video on Julius Malema where he was calling for Zimbabweans to, for once, go home and fix their issues on the 23rd of August, 2023. I think everyone would just see it as a noble gesture. This is just Julius Malema encouraging Zimbabweans to at least be responsible. But here comes Mr. Benson Matinyarare with another vision. What is your real issue here?
I think the problem that we have had with Zimbabwe is Zimbabwe has got refugees that are being displaced from Zimbabwe into South Africa in particular and other SADC countries. And this is causing a lot of acrimony and a lot of strain in SADC. South African government is unable to deliver services to its people because of the refugees that are coming in, taking up the little services that should be given to South Africans. They are now being divided with the refugees that are coming from Zimbabwe. That is not fair. However, it's part and parcel of neighbors living with each other. Just the same way that when South Africans were fighting the Boers, we took them in just after independence and allowed them to come into our countries. And the Boers attacked us for allowing Mkhonto weSizwe and the PAC military wing to come into our country and to train there and then to use Zimbabwe as a thoroughfare to come and fight with weapons in South Africa. It was that gesture that allows the South Africans to accept us today. However, once the South Africans have accepted us into South Africa, they can't just keep Zimbabweans in their country as refugees who consume their services without doing something about it. So, what do they need to do about it? Number one, they need to support Zimbabwe in dealing with the cause of these refugees coming to South Africa. And the cause of these refugees coming to South Africa, who only start coming into South Africa once Zimbabwe is under sanctions. Before Zimbabwe was under sanctions, Zimbabweans were never illegal immigrants into South Africa. That means that the sanctions have become the cause. And because sanctions are the cause, we're saying to South Africa, let's deal with the sanctions imposed illegally by the United States, Canadians, UK, Europe, and the Australians. How do we deal with them? We need to acknowledge them as the problem that is displacing the refugees. We need to do like what Europe has done with Ukraine. Europe has united with Ukraine to fight Russia to stop Ukrainian refugees from being spread into Europe because of a war and an invasion by Russia. So, when we know that there are sanctions, and we know that these sanctions were called for by a political party in Zimbabwe that called for this illegal weapon to be used to collectively punish all Zimbabweans, to force them to vote for that political party, or to force the country to have a revolution that will again release refugees into the SADC countries again. It is important for SADC countries to accept that the opposition party in Zimbabwe is utilizing persecution, a crime against humanity, similar to terrorism, to terrorize Zimbabweans to vote for them or to revolt. They must denounce that political party as a collective if they don't want the refugees to come, if they don't want instability in the region. After that, they must then unite with Zimbabwe to fight the sanction senders, to denounce the sanctions, to go to the UN and to ask for measures to be taken to end this illegal form of warfare and persecution and crime against humanity.
So you actually mean that the claims that are always made by Fikile Mbalula, calling Nelson Chamisa a puppet, calling him just the desire of the West, they are actually something that you attest to?
They're valid. Everybody knows that the sanctions were put for MDC or the opposition, and it is written in the purpose statement of ZIDERA, which says that ZIDERA was imposed on Zimbabwe to assist Zimbabweans to achieve democratic change. Remember, now ask yourself, why would you want your sister to get democratic change only? What about democracy? Because democracy may mean we want to maintain our government. It may mean we want to change the government. The Americans are not saying we want you to have democracy, which enables you to keep your government or which enables you to pick a new government. They want you to change. And it so happens that the political party that was created in the same year that these sanctions were created was called the Movement for Democratic Change. So in other words, when you look at the meaning of this, we are imposing sanctions on Zimbabwe to force them to elect the movement for democratic change. That's regime change agenda. And it is an agenda to force Zimbabweans to vote for the opposition and democratic change. That is not democracy.
So where
That
does Julius
coercion.
Malema fits in here on his noble gesture to hire
So,
buses for Zimbabweans to go home and vote?
so when Julius Malema comes and says Zimbabweans must go and vote in Zimbabwe, when he knows that there is sanctions in Zimbabwe that have punished these Zimbabweans, that have forced these Zimbabweans to migrate, forced them to come into South Africa to be refugees. And now he says that these people who have been killed by hunger, these people who've been killed by a lack of services, these people who've been killed by a lack of jobs, these people who've been killed by a lack of water and healthcare, must now go back to the country where they're being persecuted by sanctions. He is asking those people to go and remove the government by voting against the government, voting for democratic change, voting for the movement of democratic change because of the suffering that they suffered that chased them out of the country. Now remember, the Refugee Convention is clear. A refugee is a person who is persecuted, denied water, healthcare, beaten, denied education, denied basic services, and he runs away from the place he's being persecuted to go and seek refuge in another country, and is not willing to go back to where he was persecuted because the persecution still exists. That's a refugee, according to the Refugee Convention. When you force a refugee to go back where they are being persecuted, and Zimbabweans are being persecuted by sanctions, you are asking them to go back to be terrorized, go back to be persecuted, or go back to fight their persecution. How do people who are persecuted by sanctions fight back? They then decide that, you know what, let's remove that government, put in the opposition, maybe the sanctions might end. That's not democracy. So Julius knows that. He has been on record himself to say that there are illegal sanctions in Zimbabwe. He has been on record himself to say that the Europeans and the Americans are persecuting Zimbabweans. Why would he force Zimbabweans to go back there without addressing what is persecuting the Zimbabweans? It's because he is advocating for regime change. Why? Because the white people who fund him, the Stratcom that fund him, the Ruperts that fund him, are now influencing him and have positioned him through South African media to become an influencer of what happens on the continent. And now he's trying to influence regime change. And we, as awakened Zimbabweans, cannot tolerate that nonsense. From a man who says he wants to also come and take land in South Africa and is going to go under sanctions. South Africa will go under sanctions when they take land. Why would he support, therefore, any sanctions and an opposition that is being paid by the West to reverse land reform? Why would he support that unless he's a sellout?
You also talk about that Zimbabwean elections are not going to be free and fair, and they've never been free and fair. Why do you say that?
Well, the moment that you had sanctions persecuting people, making them suffer, and stopping the government from delivering services to its people, it automatically meant that the government is being sabotaged to look bad so that people would never vote for it. Automatically, once there are conditions like that, the persecution, punishment of civilians, the deaths of civilians who are dying because of diseases because they can't get medicine, and they perceive their government as the reason why they can't get medicines, those people will vote against the government. And this has been proved by a study that was done at the New Jersey College by a professor called Professor Benson Park. Professor Benson Park is from Korea, and he went to do a study in an American university in which he confirmed that sanctions that have been imposed on 59 countries have always seen a removal of the governments by elections because sanctions benefit the opposition over the incumbent government. So sanctions are scientifically proved to be a means of rigging elections. He even has in his study MDC as a case study proving that they were able to get 43% for Morgan Tsvangirai in the elections of 2002 because of sanctions. So we know for a fact that sanctions rig elections, they give an advantage to the opposition, and to some extent he admits that the reason Americans continue to utilize sanctions is to cause regime change. If we've got such a study, if we know that this is what sanctions do, why are we having elections under unfair conditions in which persecution, deaths, people die under sanctions, sickness under sanctions, families divided under sanctions, people displaced under sanctions, millions of Zimbabweans have been turned into refugees? If you know that that persecution is similar to beating people and shooting people and raping people to vote for a person, why is it acceptable to utilize economic coercive measures to force people to vote, but it's not acceptable for you to beat people, kill people, murder people, yet it's one and the same thing?
Mr. Rutendo, thank you so much. We have reached our time limit, and I'll be expecting to have you again here on this conversation. And thank you so much for your support, for the way that you continue to grace us on this platform. You know, I was talking to one of my guys who also do political content, and we were just talking about how Zimbabweans are never willing to participate on platforms which talk about politics. Sometimes, not necessarily to come and talk about politics. Maybe let's talk about religion or let's talk about soccer. But the fact that this platform has got some political connotations, people, they just don't want. So we are happy that people like you always grace us and give some integrity to our platforms.
Thank you so much. You must remember, Zimbabweans are self-centered people. So a lot of them don't share, not because they're afraid of anything, but why should I give you my knowledge? Why should I share my ideas? And that's why we tend to be backward in some of the areas where we should be actually leading. And South Africans are much more open to discussion, much more open to ideas. That's why my video has been shared even by Fikile and Balula. It doesn't mean I'm not saying anything contentious, but they believe that the sharing of ideas calls for change, makes a better society. That is something that South Africa is leading on, and we need to learn how to do that in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, and I'm glad that probably will or I will be part of those pioneers in Zimbabwe who develop that culture. And with that, we are out.